Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on a game called Realms of Magic. This is developed by Polished Games and was released in 2022. And when I first saw the game, I was intrigued right off the bat because it advertises itself as a sandbox RPG with a living, breathing world in which you can become whatever you really want to be. You can, of course, adventure around as a mighty warrior or a powerful mage or some combination thereof, or you can eschew adventure entirely in favor of gathering resources and crafting things out of them, building your own house, starting your own farm, creating your own business, and becoming a local legend for it. That all sounds really interesting, and it was enough to get me to try the game out. And what I found after trying this game out is that what was advertised and what was actually delivered are very different things. You see, the game is advertised as a sandbox role-playing game where, regardless of whether you choose to be an adventurer or a merchant or a farmer or whatever, it's all valid and it's going to leave some kind of mark on the world around you. In reality, the only true choices you have are what your character looks like and what their abilities are. When you go through character creation, you select whether your character is male or female, and you select what their character race is, whether it be human, orc, dwarf, whatever. And while the character's race determines what starting special abilities they have, everything else about the choice is purely cosmetic. It doesn't matter whether your character is male or female or what race they are, they're going to have access to all the same stuff throughout the remainder of the game. It's just whatever their particular starting ability is that's going to change. Some of these are just passive bonuses, like the humans increase to the amount of experience points they gain for all of the professions. I'll talk about those a bit more in a moment. Whereas others might actually have an active ability. For example, goblins get the ability to double jump immediately, whereas all of the other races have to wait until the character is level 30 for them to be able to unlock it in the talent tree. Regardless of the choice you've made, you don't get any further customization, just appearance, character race, and then of course you can name your character, and then from there you get the option of either playing through the tutorial or skipping the tutorial. And if you play through the tutorial, not only will it introduce you to all the basic mechanics of the game, but it will also give you a bit of extra experience in a few of the professions, as well as a couple of extra items that you wouldn't get if you didn't complete the tutorial. It doesn't make a huge difference, but if you're interested in min-maxing, then you probably would want to complete the tutorial. And obviously on your first playthrough, you want to complete the tutorial anyway. Now, if you choose not to complete the tutorial, then you just start immediately in the village of Woodbury, whereas if you go through the tutorial, then you have a whole sequence where you basically aid a necromancer in his dealings until some inquisitors show up and take him down. And then from there, you're free to go wherever you want to go that's accessible in the world. Now, either way, you will eventually end up in the village of Woodbury, and this is where you can start interacting with NPCs. Some of them will sell you things, some of them will give you work to do, whether that be just gathering materials or crafting things for them or just delivering items. And sometimes you'll get quests that will take you to specific locations and require you to either defeat a powerful enemy there or grab some item and return, and then that may or may not lead into another quest. Now, there is an overarching storyline to the game, but it's very much in the background, and whenever you're interacting with the actual main story quests, they don't actually feel much like main story quests. This is because every single thing in this game is localized. By that, I don't just mean that every single quest is only going to take place within a specific region of the map. I mean, it also applies to the types of resources you can gather and the types of enemies you're going to face. Each region has its own specific terrain, its own specific trees, its own specific farm crops, its own specific mineable ores, so on and so forth, with the only notable exceptions there being certain types of enemies that will pop up in 2 locations instead of only 1. For example, you might encounter a warg as a boss monster in one particular region, and then when you go to the next region, it becomes a standard type of enemy that you'll encounter. And the way the main story quests, in massive air quotes, function is that you go to whichever NPC hands out the main story quests, and you just do jobs for them until eventually they run out of jobs, and you either move to a different NPC to start accepting quests from, or they tell you that whatever problem you were dealing with in this region is now solved, and you can go to some other NPC that they'll specify in the next region in order to continue getting more jobs. And they very much feel like jobs that you're getting from a local authority rather than anything connecting the main story of the game. They do have an undercurrent of storyline as you get further into the game, and it becomes a bit more clear that there are forces working behind the scenes that are ultimately trying to bring the Old Kingdom to ruin, but you really don't get any of that until pretty late into Act 2, which is when you get to the second region of the game. Each region of the game is basically an act of the story. And all you really get is, well, there was some shadowy person who was trying to pit the elves and the humans against each other. And then you get to the next region, and there's a cult infestation. And pretty much at the very end of that questline, you get, oh, by the way, there was some shadowy figure that was influencing the cult and was giving them the promise of power, which is why they were doing what they were doing. So if you want to know more and get on their trail again, you're going to have to go to the next region. And that's the way the story is told. You really don't feel like there's an actual main storyline as much as there are just regional main quests, and when you complete whatever quest is specific to that region, whatever problem is specific to that region, you're just going to move on to the next region. And by the way, there happen to be shadowy forces behind the scenes, and presumably when you get to the end of the game, that's when you're going to finally deal with whatever shadowy force is responsible for trying to bring the Old Kingdom to ruin. There are obviously a few problems with trying to tell the story in this manner. The first is that a lot of players are probably not even going to notice the overarching storyline because they're going to be focused on whatever they're actually doing in any given moment, and you're only getting references and hints throughout most of it. Thus, the player is not really going to know or care what the main storyline is. The second problem with this is that despite being told that what you're ultimately doing with this main storyline is saving the Old Kingdom, it never feels like there are any stakes to what you're doing. The regions are operating exactly the same regardless of whether you complete the main story quests in those regions or not. Hell, the NPCs in those regions don't even notice when you've completed those quest lines unless they're specifically involved with giving you those quest lines, leading to some particularly odd things like when you go into one region and the main quest line involves you taking down the tyrannical ruler of that region. And after you do so, and you leave his bloody corpse on the floor, nobody seems to notice or care that he's gone. The local populace still acts like he specifically is subjugating the populace with his tyrannical guards, and the guards themselves still act like he's in power. Despite the developers saying this is a living, breathing world, it is in fact a static world. You are occasionally given some choices on how you want to complete a particular quest line, but they make no difference either way. The world does not change. There is no adaptation to any decisions you make. You just go into a region, you complete a bunch of quests, and that's it. You just move on to the next region and you repeat the process until eventually you get to the end of the game. And then presumably after you've beaten the final boss and cleared the main storyline, it's back to the general sandbox, with absolutely nobody noticing or caring that the great evil that threatens the Old Kingdom is dealt with. Obviously, I don't know if that's exactly what happens, but I have a feeling that's what happens if what I have experienced up to this point is any indication. So it's a storyline that a lot of the player base probably isn't even going to notice, and it feels like there are absolutely no stakes, and that nothing you do actually is going to change the Old Kingdom for the better or worse, because despite the developers saying it's a living, breathing world, it is in fact a completely static world. And even though the game does give you some level of choices, there are no consequences for those choices. I mean, hell, I was running around with necromancy powers, and necromancy is explicitly forbidden in the Old Kingdom, to the point where practitioners of necromancy are punished with death. And nobody noticed or cared when I was summoning skeletons right in front of them and using them to slaughter my foes. And that's another big problem with the way this story is written, because even when you're doing things that should matter, they don't have any consequences, which then in turn exposes the fact that this really isn't a role-playing game at all. It has a few very light RPG elements in the form of the leveling system and, to a lesser degree, the quests. Because quests can be in just about anything, it doesn't have to be an RPG, but leveling systems are very much an RPG element, and just tacking on the leveling system to this does not in fact make it a proper role-playing game. It just means that it's a sandbox game with some light RPG elements. That in and of itself would be fine if they weren't advertising this as a sandbox role-playing game with a living, breathing world. Based on the way the store page is written, it gives you the impression that not only do you have effectively limitless freedom with how to set up your character, but you also have limitless freedom to wander around the world and do whatever you want, wherever you want, build your own homes, build your own settlements, create your own businesses, and that the people will remember you for it. And that's just not really what happens in this game. What actually happens is you find out almost immediately that not only is there barely even an overarching story in the game, and not only do the main story quests for each particular region only deal with a local problem and that they have no impact on the world around you, really, but that the effectively limitless freedom the game promises you doesn't actually exist. Oh sure, whenever you level up and you get a talent point that you can spend on the talent tree, you can spend it however you want, but the talent trees themselves are set up to where you can only have access to a very limited number of options until you hit certain level thresholds. And not only that, but once you start delving into the talent trees themselves, the options within them are extremely limited. You'll only have maybe 2 or 3 core abilities in any given talent tree, and the rest of the things you're requiring are either just passive bonuses for the character overall, or they're upgrades for the various abilities that you have, or slightly alternate versions of them in cases of stuff like the summoning spells, where you can summon weaker monsters and such at the beginning, and then the further you get into the progression, the more powerful things you'll summon, and the further you get into the game, the less useful the weaker summons are, so you're just going to replace your previous summon ability with the new summon ability, so it might as well just be a straight-up upgrade anyway. Really, the biggest improvements you're going to find for your character are just the various pieces of equipment that you'll find either in secret areas or that you can craft yourself or buy from the various merchants. And you'll find out almost immediately with that the best equipment you just find scattered around the world in various secret areas hidden in the protected areas, which are the specific locations like a particular mine or a temple or something along those lines that is pre-built by the developers rather than just being a generic area for you to explore. And the same goes for towns, by the way. You can wander around a town and find various secrets hidden around there as well, and it's more or less the same kind of thing. Now, on the positive side, with all the best gear in the game being hidden in all of these secret locations, it gives you some incentive to explore. On the negative side, that tends to get very repetitive very quickly, because basically the only things you're going to be doing in these locations is wandering around, finding a few monsters or other types of enemies to fight, and that's it, actually. There's nothing else to these locations. You just go there, you fight some things, you maybe pick up a bunch of stuff that's scattered around the area, and then you leave, and that's it. The only exception there is the quest-specific locations, which do have more quest-related things for you to do, but the quests themselves are usually so simple and so straightforward. Stuff like just go talk to this person, or deliver an item or a bunch of items to an NPC, or go to a location and just fight stuff there, that those also get really repetitive. And more importantly, it makes the crafting system effectively worthless. Because the way they've set up the crafting system is that you don't have access to all of the recipes immediately. You only get those as you level up the various crafting skills. And there are only two ways of leveling up your crafting skills. The first is simply to use them, so you craft the various things that fall within that category. The second way is to use experience scrolls, which you find scattered in the secret areas around the world, and sometimes enemies will drop them as well. Whenever you use one of these scrolls, it will give you a large amount of experience for whatever the attached skill is, and it doesn't have to be the crafting skills, it can also be some of the gathering skills as well. And that's another thing too, you have gathering skills, and those determine how quickly and efficiently you can gather materials under their purview. But anyway, as you continue to level up these crafting skills, you will gradually gain new recipes, and you will eventually hit the point where you're going to need a bunch of different materials to be able to craft things, and those materials are all sourced by different gathering skills and different crafting skills. So for example, if you want to craft yourself a bunch of heavy armor all the time, you can't just level up your smithing, you also have to level up your mining skill as well as your smelting skill, because those are your primary skills for gathering metal in terms of ore, and of course smelting that into usable bars for the smithing skill. But then to be able to craft the armor itself, you're also going to need different types of cloth and different types of leather, and the various types of cloth that you can produce are determined by your weaving skill, whereas the various types of leather you can tan are determined by your tanning skill. So not only will you need to level up at minimum 4 skills to be able to craft better gear, but you also need to be able to source the various materials for them, and most of that you're going to have to do yourself. So you're going to have to go find wherever the mineral deposits are and mine the ore. You're going to have to go find wherever the creatures are that produce the type of leather you're looking for, take them down, take the leather, and refine the leather. You're going to need to find whatever plant and or animal produces the fiber you need to be able to produce the cloth that you're using, and or rope, depending on what item it is, and then go through all the processing for that as well. And by the end of it, you have completed a heavy grind in order to get things that are actually weaker than the stuff you can just find in the various secret areas anyway. And the secret areas generally aren't difficult to find and aren't difficult to get to, so you might as well just not bother crafting your own gear. After all, this is a single player only game, so you don't have any co-op partners you can give it to, and it also doesn't have a party system, so you don't have any party members you can give it to. So the only point to crafting the gear is to give yourself experience points in the equipment crafting skills that are associated with it, and to sell it. And sure, that money can be used to complete certain quests, and it can also be used to purchase materials or equipment or consumable items, but chances are you're just going to be finding those things all over the place if you're exploring the locations anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And if it's better to just wander around the world and find these things instead of crafting them yourself, then that leaves the only craftables that seemingly are worth creating being stuff like furniture or various blocks or things like that you can build a, presumably, house or some sort of settlement out of. And you find out pretty quickly that the only reason you would actually want to do that is so you can have a place to store all of the random crap you find all over the place. Because, of course, inventory space is quite limited. So you set about building your own house, settlement, castle, whatever you want to call it, and you find that you can't do it in any of the towns. The only places you can do it are in the unprotected tiles of the overworld. These are areas where you just go in and it randomly generates all of the terrain, as well as any kinds of monsters or other types of enemies that you'll encounter there, and you can just start building stuff. And the way that works is you can place blocks in the foreground or the background. If it's background, you right-click. If it's foreground, you left-click. And as long as you're in one of those unprotected tiles on the overworld, you can just place blocks pretty much wherever you want, and everything works pretty smoothly. There are, however, a few particularly odd quirks. You can't place any objects on tables. For some baffling reason, the height is not sufficient on the tables for you to actually be able to place objects on them. So you either have to place them on the floor, or you have to place them on objects that actually are at the appropriate height to be able to place the object on. And while the system is clearly heavily inspired by Terraria, and in fact functions almost exactly the same as Terraria, there is one significant difference. In Terraria, you can get NPCs at your settlement as long as you have a room set up for them that has specific requirements for being designated as a room, and you complete certain in-game milestones and such like that in order to be able to unlock them. Meanwhile, in Realms of Magic, you can get NPCs at your settlement or house or whatever, but unlike the NPCs in Terraria, there's no conditions you need to fulfill. They don't even need to have a room. You can just have them standing out in the open, in the elements, and they will not care. And more importantly, you don't have to fulfill any conditions in order to unlock the NPCs. You just find them standing around in the middle of nowhere as you wander around the unprotected tiles on the overworld, and the NPCs you run across are going to be completely random. In my particular case, as I was wandering around, I ended up finding 2 farmers, 2 hunters, and an herbalist. And not only was that annoyingly skewed in favor of things that I wasn't really working on at the time, but it's also just really unsatisfying. In a game like Terraria, you actually have to work for these NPCs. You have to create a room for them and furnish that room, and you also have to fulfill specific gameplay conditions in order to unlock the NPC in the first place. It feels like a reward for an achievement you've done. In Realms of Magic, on the other hand, it just feels like a pointless addition that they threw in there because, well, Terraria has it, so we're heavily inspired by Terraria to the point where we're almost copying them. We might as well just throw that in here too. And really, that's the biggest problem this game has. It feels like it's just thrown together. Like they had the idea of, what if we combined Terraria with a leveling system and an overarching storyline with quests, and then they just called it a day. For a game that espouses its living, breathing world and a significant amount of depth, there's really no depth to the game at all. It's very simple, very straightforward, and gets extremely repetitive extremely quickly. And it's abundantly clear that the player base for the game picked up on that rather quickly, because there's barely any information about the game available. It doesn't have a detailed wiki or anything like that. And if you look at the achievement stats, while about 42-ish% of players have completed Act 1, which is Woodbury, they've gone through the whole Woodbury storyline, by the time you get to the end of the second town, that number has dropped by half, and then when you go down to Act 3, which is the third town, it's dropped in half again. So now you're down to a bit over 11% of the player base having completed only the third act of the story, and there were 4 more acts to go after that. The number of folks who've completed Act 4, about 5.5% of the player base. And by the time you get to the end of the storyline, and people have actually completed the main storyline, you're looking at about 3% of the total player base. And frankly, I have a hard time comprehending the sheer levels of patience required to put up with the game long enough to be able to finish it. Because I made it through 3 acts of the storyline, I completed 3 regions of the game, and then I got to the 4th region, and it was there that my patience finally wore out. I was just tired of it being so ridiculously repetitive, and it never seeming to lead anywhere. There wasn't any kind of interesting story keeping me playing it. The crafting was effectively pointless because there's not really any point to building anything, and there's certainly not any point to crafting your own gear when you can just find better stuff anyway. And the combat system is so simplistic that there's just absolutely nothing to figure out with it, so that wasn't even holding my interest. So I just said, you know what, it's just not worth finishing. It's not necessarily a terrible game, but unless you are really, really into the whole Terraria-esque resource gathering, building, and crafting without it actually having any real depth to it or any real meaning to it, then I don't really see you being able to get all that much out of Realms of Magic. Development on it was finished a couple of years ago, and the studio went on to make a Vampire Survivors-esque horde game. And then after that, they said they were working on a sequel to Realms of Magic, as well as a remake of Realms of Magic at the same time, which is incredibly weird. And I can't help but feel like them trying to stretch their resources out like that is just going to backfire on them in the long run. But as for Realms of Magic, as it currently is available, it's $20, and you get far less of a value proposition than games like Terraria, which are half the price, still have active development, and also have tons of mod support and multiplayer. So there's not really much reason to pick up Realms of Magic. Maybe after they get the remake and the sequel done, it might be worth taking another look at these games and see if they've learned from their mistakes and significantly improved things. But this particular game, Realms of Magic in and of itself currently, I cannot remotely recommend unless you are just a die-hard fan of this particular style of gameplay and are willing to put up with the incredible amounts of repetition that just don't really have any payoff just because you like doing these things to begin with. But even then, I really wouldn't recommend picking up Realms of Magic unless you can get it on sale for a good discount, because, let's face it, when you compare it price-wise to games like Starbound or Terraria, it's not going to win that comparison. But hey, I guess if you've somehow completely exhausted Terraria and or Starbound, and you want more of that particular gameplay style and don't really care whether it's refined or not, well, this certainly is another game in that style. I just really hope that a sequel actually realizes the potential that the game had just from the ideas they were putting forth here. Because a lot of those ideas are very solid. Having a detailed crafting system, having a world where you can make your own mark in it, whether that be creating your own business or going on adventures or whatever, with a lot of freedom and flexibility to build out your character however you want and have them interact in the world however you want, and have that world actually react to the things that you're doing because it is supposed to be a living, breathing world. That all sounds really cool. It's just that the execution in this particular case was incredibly lacking. None of those ideas were really fleshed out, and the end result is just so repetitive and tedious that it becomes incredibly boring. So I'll certainly keep an eye on announcements from the developers to see what they're doing with the remake and the sequel, and maybe I'll do a follow-up video whenever the remake's out and or the sequel's out, and we'll see how things have changed. But as for Realms of Magic as it is currently available, again, I really can't recommend it unless this is just absolutely your kind of game and you pick it up on sale for a really deep discount, because you're probably not going to be able to play it for very long without getting bored. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. I know in the last video I said I really needed to mess around with something that would actually be really fun and that I could recommend, but this is something that I had been working on in the background while I was working on other stuff, and the simple fact of the matter is I really needed the disk space that was being occupied by the gameplay footage I had recorded, so I went ahead and put together this video, and hopefully the next video will be of something that I can truly recommend without reservations. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you all in later videos.